President of Azerbaijan blames Russia for causing the Christmas Day plane crash that killed 38 people and is urging Moscow to accept responsibility and compensate families of the victims. For more on this and the latest in the war, the Russia-Ukraine war, and other issues, we'll talk China as well. DeWardrick McNeil, former Defense Department appointee in the Obama administration. He's now managing director at Longview Global and a CNBC contributor. Thanks, DeWardrick, for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Joe.
Happy New Year. Nothing much going on in the world. You got some? We used to have predictions for 2025. I wouldn't, or for years. I wouldn't even ask you to try to do that. But let's start with Russia and Ukraine and how these developments play into things. This is not a total one-off for what we've seen in terms of the Russian military and commercial flights.
Yeah, Joe, unfortunately, this is a real tragedy. But to your point, this is not an isolated incident, particularly for Russia, who we know now shot down MH17, a Malaysian airline flight. And look, this Azerbaijan flight 8243, was clearly impacted by an air defense system. And the longer these sorts of regional conflicts go on, Joe, the more likely it is that you're going to have some of these mishaps. Most people who travel on a commercial airliner believe that these air defense systems have the ability to identify a combatant aircraft versus a commercial aircraft. But as we're seeing, that's not always the case. And people do end up killed by military anti-aircraft systems.
What do you think the future holds under the Trump presidency for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine? And does this factor into those negotiations? It's probably a totally separate but related, I guess, conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real issue here, Joe, is that both sides have given some indication long before the Trump election, but particularly after Trump's election, that they're at a stalemate, that they're exhausted, that they're looking for some sort of an off-ramp to cessation of combat, armed combat. I will not say cessation of hostilities because there are other things that could still go on in cyberspace and gray zone. But I think both sides now are looking for some sort of cessation of armed conflict. Trump says he can solve this in 24 hours. This will not be solved in 24 hours. But I think finding a way for Ukraine and Russia to likely freeze this conflict in place, so you won't have a resolution of all of the concerns that started this conflict, but just a pause, which we'll see how long that pause endures, Joe.
DeWardrick, just on your first point about commercial aircraft not necessarily being able to be distinguished from military aircraft that would be coming through, I was under the impression that most commercial aircraft were being diverted, that they would not fly over Russian airspace. Is that the case? If you're somebody who's traveling overseas, should you assume that? Which planes are still flying over Russian airspace?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Becky. Most of the commercial airliners in the EU, certainly in the U.S., have banned Russian aircraft from their airspace, and Russia has reciprocated. So they will not fly into Russian airspace. But there are other countries that do fly those routes. Most have diverted to the polar routes coming from Asia to Europe and so on. But there are still commercial aircraft that moves through that space that unfortunately are at risk of being misidentified and targeted.